Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to finish our series of lectures on the events leading up to uh, the Civil War, the Decade of Crisis. This should be a short one. We're just going to kind of talk about secession, why it happened, and kind of lay out where both the North and the South are as far as resources, and their ability to make war. So first of all, secession it just means like leaving, in this case, leaving the union. Um, so, which states left? Well, we'll see that just shortly after Lincoln gets elected, South Carolina's the first to go, right? They've been talking about this for a while, ever since the Tariff of Abominations. They've wanted to leave not just over the expansion of slavery into the territories, which is, ultimately what Lincoln was campaigning on, but they wanted to leave just because of tariffs, right? The tariffs that helped northern industries that made things more expensive in the South. So South Carolina clearly first to go. They're out. Once they leave, we're going to see five other states go. Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi will follow suit. And then after that, we'll see another wave with Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Texas tries to hold out. They try to hold out for a while. The local politicians recognize, like, we don't want to fight the North. The North's got too much capacity to make war. So a lot of the Texas politicians are like, this is probably not a great idea. But the people of Texas essentially aren't having it and force the politicians to leave the union. And so that ends up being your list of southern states. So, why did the South leave the Union? Well, one, they believed that they were being overwhelmed uh, by the North politically. The balance between free states and slave states have tipped to the North. The North's industry is, businessmen, they feel like are pushing policies that are hurting the South, things like tariffs. And so they believe that their way of life is just being overrun by a northern majority. They feel like the southern way of life is being threatened. Remember, they have that hierarchical social structure that we had talked about in the beginning of the series of lectures on the antebellum period, and they really feel like that the North is not just like, it's not that the northern style of life is challenging the southern style of life. It's that the North is actively threatening the southern way of life. They're sending down underground railroad conductors, and they're sending guys like John Brown that are starting revolutions in the South. And so they really do feel like their way of life is under attack from, you'll hear later in the civil rights movement a term called northern agitators. And so they're complaining about that. Race baiting. Southern newspapers have talked about, if the North gets their way, African Americans will get the right to vote, and they'll take over the South. They'll take over the governments. In certain states like South Carolina and Mississippi, there's more black people than there are white people, and so they're terrified of that. And intermarriage. They essentially are going to make a claim that black men are just going to run around and essentially steal all of the white women, and so they create this fear of, if we don't have slavery, then this is what America will look like with freed African Americans running around. And so the newspapers have a lot to blame with it as well. They're going to argue that the South feels like they're pushed in a corner, and if it's just human nature, that if you push somebody into a corner, you're going to find out exactly how violent they can be. And what's the pushing in the corner? Well, it's not enforcing the fugitive slave law. Well, now we can't trust you because you made a promise and you didn't do it. It's the bloody Kansas, and the fact that the people of Kansas, they're going to say, even though it was a rigged election, the people of Kansas voted for slavery, and the North set up a government in exile I shouldn't say government in exile, but a second government against the will of the people. And then John Brown coming down and attacking us, and all of these things, they're going to say, you've attacked us, you've attacked us, you've attacked us, and you left us no other option. So we're going to go to an extreme measure and leave the Union. They're also going to have some economic reasons. We've talked about this. They want direct trade with Europe. They don't want the North to dictate the South's trade with Europe, because if that happens, the North will institute tariffs that hurt the South. And so they don't want tariffs, right? A tariff is just a tax on an import. So if you make British goods more expensive, that means that your people will more likely buy the more expensive American products because the tax makes the British product more expensive. Well, that hurts Southern farmers because they don't make goods. So they don't benefit from people buying American. They just want to buy the cheapest thing possible. And so, if a British hammer was $1 and an American hammer was $2, they want $1 hammer. But when you put a $2 tariff on that British hammer, all of a sudden now, if you're a Southern farmer, you can't buy $1 hammer anymore. The cheapest hammer you can buy is the $2 American hammer. And so, the Southerners just see that as raising costs and hurting them. They want to be able to revive the African slave trade, although this is not consistent in the South. There are many people in the South that don't agree with the idea of expanding this African slave trade, actually going back to Africa and stealing more people to become slaves. As a matter of fact, when the Confederacy actually comes around, they're going to agree not to do that. And so, and not necessarily because they're great people, but because they know that there will be international outrage. But either way, they're going to agree not to do that, even though some people will say, if we leave the Union, we can do that. One, they believe that if they leave, it will force them to develop their own factories, their own factory system. And mostly it's because they thought it would be peaceful. They really didn't think that the North and Abraham Lincoln would be willing to fight any kind of long, protracted war to keep them in the Union. The North, on the other hand, right? Why didn't the North just let them go? Well, one, because it would be the death of democracy, right? And it would be the death of our American democracy, right? It would be failure. And so to the ideas established in the founding. And so, nobody wants it. Lincoln doesn't want to be the president that lets it all fall apart, right? I mean, we've survived all kinds of things since our inception, war with the British and then war with the British again, and, just all kinds of economic crises. And so, nobody wants to be the guy that lets it all fall apart. We believe that if it happens, then if the South is allowed to leave, there might be other states that leave as well. The border states that have stuck around, states like Missouri, there's really, what if they're just kind of sitting this out and seeing how it's going to play. And if the South was allowed to leave, Missouri would probably leave too. And who knows, maybe Maine would want to leave because they don't like, they want more tariffs on fishing, and the people of Pennsylvania don't like. Then the states would just, if we allow states to leave the Union just because they don't like a federal law that gets passed, states would be leaving all the time. And so we can't allow that. That would be anarchy. And in reality, it just would send a huge signal for weakness. Remember, we just fought a war in 1812 because the British thought our experiment with democracy would fail. And so if the Civil War doesn't end with America united, we just send a signal out to the world that you can pick on us and bully us and beat us up because, we can't even keep our own house in order. And so, we just can't allow that to happen. So North versus South. Who's got what? Who's most prepared for war? On paper, it's going to look like a certain victory for the North, but it won't be that way, and we'll talk about why. So the South has 11 states, about 9 million people, about 1.2 million fighting age, and this is a little misrepresenting because it's 1.2 million, but they're not being reinforced with new immigrants. So this 1.2 million, when they're gone, you're pretty much done. Right? There's no renewal of soldiers. They will have about 20,000 factories, like Atlanta's relatively industrialized for the time period, and about 9,000 miles of railroad. About 100,000 workers, but 3.5 million slaves. And so, their economy is going to be able to keep going because, they're going to be able to use slave labor for that, which is essentially free. Like the North, on the other hand, 23 states, so more than double the number of states. 22 million people, again, more than double the number of people, 4 million fighting age. And so, I mean, you're talking more than 3 times, almost 4 times as many fighting age people. But that's misleading because the North has constant immigration coming in from Europe because people are moving to the North to get North American factory jobs. And so, even though they've got 4 million people, when somebody dies for the North, they can replace them with, an Irish immigrant relatively, and I'm saying this relatively easily, much more easily than the South. They've got 100,000 factories compared to 20,000 Southern factories. The North will outproduce guns, bullets, boots, and just anything, tents, knives, cannons. Will just massively be able to outproduce Southern production. The South pretty much has to rely on goods that are purchased from foreign powers that can sneak through a blockade and essentially like stealing, northern cannons after they, get victories on the battlefield. They'll have 20,000 miles of rail, which means we can move troops around quicker and we can move supplies so we can better supply our troops. Our troops will be better fed. They'll have, it'll be easier for them to have and maintain, ammo and things like that. It just makes war much easier to fight. They'll have 1.1 million workers. Just that's a huge amount of workers. And again, a replenishing amount of workers because of constant immigration. So other advantages of North, some things that you might not think about. The North has more food than the South. South has all kinds of agriculture. Their entire economy is based on farming, but it's farming cotton. You can't eat cotton. The North and the West, we have farmers too, right? They're a lot of times smaller farmers, but those farmers are growing food. And when you're fighting a war, right? Corn and cabbage are much more valuable to you than cotton. We got more cows. You don't have huge cattle farms in the South because you're using that land to grow cotton. There's exceptions. Texas, obviously, will have gigantic cattle ranches. But for the most part, the North is just going to seriously outproduce food, which means we can better feed our soldiers. Right. And we have the ability to, move stuff around because of rail. Now, the South, they have some advantages too. And the biggest one is their generals. General Lee is probably the single greatest military genius in the history of humankind. And there will be people out there that will discount that. Alexander the Great, sure, maybe Napoleon. There are other arguments to be made out there, but Lee is in that list. And so, he is an absolute military genius, and Stonewall Jackson and Longstreet aren't far behind. As a matter of fact, if Longstreet would have got his way at the Battle of Gettysburg, this might have been a completely different war. Their top tier generals are far superior to the Union generals. And when we start the lectures on the Civil War, you'll just see that the North has got more men, more guns at almost every single one of these battles. But the South are going to whoop them and whoop them and whoop them and whoop them, essentially until Grant comes into power and just steamrolls everybody. So South has better generals. They have better soldiers, more familiar with wilderness and weapons, right? Like the average soldier is kind of that poor, white person from the South who grew up with a gun in their hand. Most of the fighting, with the exception of just a couple battles, are going to be done in the South on Southern territory. So they're going to be in areas that they know they're the layout, so they can get the high ground better, and the local populations will support them by feeding them and like hiding them and masking their movements, and that's a huge advantage that the South will have. Home field advantage, right? And they're going to want to fight more. Most of the Northerners It's yeah, they dislike slavery, but man, the idea of going down into the South and risking dying to free slaves. There's some people that are going to be super passionate about that, but the average soldier is just going to be like, yeah, I'm doing it for the paycheck. Uh, Whereas the Southern soldiers really do believe they're fighting to protect their way of life. They don't, uh, a lot of them don't even think of it as like they're defending slavery, the poor whites. They really think of it as they're fighting off invaders, which is crazy, right? The war's about slavery. But they're going to fight passionately to protect their homes. Is the and even though that's kind of convoluted, they believe it, and so they're going to fight super. So they're just more motivated to fight. Also, the northern armies are, a lot of times made up of immigrants. They're fighting because they're told if they fight that they'll get their citizenship, and so they're dialing it in, doing the bare minimum. Now, that's not all the soldiers. A lot of them are going to fight incredibly bravely, but not all of them. Some of them are just, it's like, well, I showed up. I was starving in Ireland. I left to come to the United States because it's a land of plenty. And to get my citizenship, they said I had to fight in this war, so I'm going to fight, but I don't understand the customs, the land. I don't speak English, and I'm not really motivated to fight. And they tended to be less familiar with guns, and less unified around the idea of slavery. So that's it. That concludes our lecture series and on the decade of crisis or the events leading to secession. We will pick up with a new series of lectures on the Civil War shortly. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you again soon.